Shavua Tov. Today's daf is Nun Gimel, but we're going to start back here on Nun Beis, and it's kind of like in the middle of the Amud. I don't know how to count down lines here, but it's called Drusas Ze'ev, and you'll see it like a little bit above Tosas Dibra Maschil Bikol Makom. Do you see that double mem on Daf Nun Beis, Amud Beis, and Tosas Mem Mem? So if you count up a few lines, Udrusas Zev, this is the Mishnah that if the wolf puts its claws into its prey, then we assume that that prey is treifa. Omer Rav Yehuda Marav, bebehema min hazevu lamala. As far as animals are concerned, and the question is which animals have that poison, that venom in their claws, that when they attack their prey, they create such a terrible situation in the prey that it becomes a treifa. It's min haze'ev ulamala, means any animal that's either a zev or larger than a zev will make its victim into treifa. Ba'ofos min hanetz ulamala. So the nets is some sort of a predatory bird, and we're not exactly sure what it is. Back on Daf Mem Beis, there was a mention of the nets. So we'll quickly look back on Daf Mem Beis. I'm pretty sure it's called a falcon, but let's just see if I'm right. Go back to Mem Beis. Just give me a second. Sorry. So Rashi identifies it in Old French, but it's some sort of a hawk, Hawk. And once again, that bird, if it attacks another bird, will make that other bird into a treifa, and any bird that's larger than the nets, likewise. Lim'ute mai, when Rav gave us this formulation, what is he coming to exclude? And he says, Ilem lim'ute chasul, if he's coming to exclude the claws of a cat, is tonina, but we have a in our Mishnah, Drusas Hazev, and it means that only a wolf makes its victim into treifa, and that which is smaller than a wolf, for example, a cat, would certainly not make it into a treifa. So why does Rav have to repeat that which is obvious from our Mishnah? Perhaps you would say that the chiddush here of Rav is that the power of a zev to make its victim treifa would apply even if a zev attacks an animal which might be larger, let's say a cow or a bull. So that then we would interpret the Mishnah that maybe a cat could also make its victim fatally ill through its claws. But again, only smaller animals, whereas a zev is singled out by a Mishnah because a zev could attack even a larger animal than itself. So the Gemara rejects this as well. V'atnan Rabbi Yehuda Omer Drusas Hazev Bedaka U Drusas Ari Begasa. So the Mishnah already specifies that the victim, according to Rabbi Yehuda, of the clawing of a wolf is only in the case of a smaller species. And so it means that the wolf has to attack, which is called Jusazev, a daka. Daka means like a sheep, a small animal. Whereas a lion, if it puts its claws into even a larger species, would make its victim into a treifa. So therefore, there is no havamina here that a cat would be able to make its victim by clawing it into a treifa. V'chi temer Rav Yehuda miflag polig, and if you want to argue maybe Rav Yehuda's a shita on its own, v'omar Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefes Omar Rabbi Ila lo ba Rabbi Yehuda lefarish divrei chachamim. So we have an explicit statement in an Amora which identifies Rabbi Yehuda with the Tanakama, and it's one shita. And therefore, based on that understanding of Binyamin that this is all one shita, we now come to the conclusion that it's obvious from the Mishnah, and Rav wouldn't even have to teach us, that a cat with its clawing could not fatally impact on its victim. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Gavra Karomis? You're saying that there's a contradiction here based on Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes. Maybe Rav would argue with Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes. How do you know he accepted the premise of Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefes? Well, therefore, the Gemara comes up with another answer. Ibais Ema, if you like, I can give you the following answer. Li olam ute chasul. Actually, Rav agrees with Rabbi Yomi Bar Yefes, and Rabbi Yehuda is not arguing against the Tanakama, but rather interpreting the Tanakama. And the Tanakama already specified Dafka Zev to the exclusion of a Chasul. So then what again is the Chiddush of Rav? What would I think without Rav? Ma'odatem, I might have thought Urcha de Milsa Ketani. Maybe the reason why the Mishnah only mentions a wolf is because under normal circumstances, we can assume that a wolf is the kind of animal that attacks its prey, whereas a cat is usually, let's say, a scaredy cat. So therefore, you might think that if the Mishnah is only talking about that which is urche, that which is commonplace, it's not coming to exclude that weird case where a cat starts attacking, sheep or goats and putting its claws into it. But you might think that according to the Mishnah, a cat likewise could make its victim into a treifa, and therefore I need Rav to teach me no, that a cat doesn't have a din of a drusa, it doesn't have that power. Rav Chizda, drusas chasul unemia begidoim udloim, but drusas chulda biofos. Let's differentiate, says Rav Amram, between animals and cats. When it comes to animals, we discussed a wolf, and now we're going to ask the question about a cat. And Rav Amram comes under the new, shall we say, breakthrough shita that even a cat has the status of drusas chasul, but only in the case where it attacks smaller animals, like, for example, a gedi, which is a young goat, or a tle, which is a lamb. And then we have something called an nemiyah. Now, we don't know exactly what an nemiyah is. It's a small animal. According to some, it's a weasel-like animal called a marten. But be that as it may, in the case of ophos, we have drusas chulda. Right, a chulda is certainly a weasel, and it attacks birds, and it makes the birds into a treifa. That is this a chulda is such a large kind of an animal that it could make make something into a treifa. But Meisvei, the Gemara says, wait a minute, this statement of Rav Chizda is right, Rav Amram in the name of Rav Chizda is contradicted by a brisa that says Jusas Chasul, Netz, Unamia, Achati Nokev Lecholol. We're no longer talking about drusa. Drusa means the claws went into its victim. No, no, no. That's not what the power of the chasul or the netz or the namiya is. Their power is to puncture the inner intestines of the animal. Aval drusa leslie, but this poison in the claws that it doesn't have. So therefore, at this point, the Gemara thinks that this brisa has to be upheld as a reliable brisa, and it presents a contradiction to Rav Amram, because Rav Amram has a concept called drusas chasul. We don't have that in the brisa. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, how do you understand this brisa? You're asking a kasha on Rav Chizda based on a brisa. You don't even understand the brisa, because the brisa has nets. V'tizra nets lo doris, v'tnan drusas hanets. Right, the Mishnah itself talks about drusas hanets. So how can you tell me that because the brisa speaks about tinokev, that the kishkis, the abdominal cavity of the animal was punctured? That's the only reason it could create a treifa. Well, what about nets? Nets is on the list as well. We know from the Mishnah that drusas hanets makes it into a treifa, even without any sort of puncturing in the cavity. Gemara says, "Holo kasha." That question you shouldn't ask me. Why? Can be ofos, can be g'doim utloim. When the Mishnah is talking about a nets that does a clawing and creates a treifa, that's only because it claws another bird, right? This this hawk is a very powerful bird in the company of animals. The brisa that here that you quote that says that a net cannot make its victim into a treifa. It's only an issue of whether it punctured something in the innards. That's talking about a case where the nets clawed either kids or lambs, not another bird. The Gemara now goes back to Rav Chizda. Mikol makom Rav Chizda kasha. And the brisa is still against Rav Chizda because Rav Chizda was one who had the assumption that a cat or an amiyah has the ability of drusa. And the brisa says that a cat or an amiyah does not render an animal into a drusa. And the Gemara answers that he has another Tana, Rav Chizda, that he relies on, who the Omer Ki Haitana, the Sanya Beribi. Omer Beribi is one of the great Tanoim. Lo Omru Ein Drusel b'mokum she'ein matzilin. So now we get into a whole psychology of the animal. Normally, the animal reaches a certain level of power, to claw and put its venom in. But some unusual circumstances allow an animal extra power, becomes like Superman. And what's that? That's aval b'mokum sheyesh matzilin. If, let's say, somebody tries to intervene and protect the prey of the cat from the cat gets very angry at that point because yesh matzilin. So if somebody sends a first responder, to protect against the cat, then the cat gets very, very angry. And now the cat is capable of clawing in a way that fits the description of drusa and makes its victim, a little kid or a bird, into a treifa. So Rav Chizda, following this brisa of Beribi, saying that a cat or an amiyah can fatally claw kids or lambs, he's referring to a case where the amiyah or the chatul got very, very angry. Why? Because they were matzilin. Frek the Gemara, ubemakom she'ein matzilin ein drusa. Are you telling me that if no one intervenes to protect the victim, then the cat is not capable of clawing and creating that poison that we spoke about of Drus? Of aha, I'm going to tell you a story about Ahi Tarnagoles, Tavi Bei Rav Kahana. Rav Kahana had a hen, and Derat Chassul Basrei, a cat was chasing the hen. The all means it went into Idruna. Idruna is a room. Ve'itchid Russia, I'm sorry, Dosha Biape. What happened was that somehow it's not exactly clear how this happened, but before the cat who's chasing the hen was able to get a hold of the hen ran into a room, and somehow, miraculously, for the benefit of this hen, the door slammed shut in the cat's face. And the cat swiped the door with its paw. So now whatever poison was on the paw is now stuck to the door. And they found that in that place where the cat's claws hit the door, they find 5 spots of red. And the assumption is that the cat was putting its claws into the door, swiping at the door in order to get to the hen. There were no matzilin, and yet he leaves these 5 red spots on the door. What are these 5 red spots? They are the poison that comes from the claws of a cat. So the Gemara says the Gemara answers that this situation also incurs the anger of the cat. Why? It doesn't matter whether a third party, intervenes to rescue the uh, the predated, meaning the victim of the cat. But if the cat itself gets angry because the door slammed in its face, and now the cat is trying to save itself, then the cat will be able to shoot off this venom. Rabbanan reject Beribi. They hold that a cat could never, ever, even if it's angry as you can imagine, in expel a venom and make its a poison. So what are we going to do with these 5 spots of red? And the Gemara answers that Ziara Isle Velo Koli Ziara. Again, this is such anatomy here that a cat also has poison in its claws, but not the same lethal poison that could possibly kill a kid or a lamb. So the 5 spots of red indicate the poison in the claws of a cat, but that poison could never actually fatally impact on kids and lambs. Ika de Amri. Another possible transmission of this answer the Gemara, Hamani Beribihi. You know what? Maybe the brisa that says that if you have someone who's clawed by a cat or by a netz or by an emir, and there was no puncture in the abdominal cavity, therefore there's no treifa, and that brisa was authored by Beribi. Now, Beribi was the one who said that if there are no rescuers, a cat could never fatally claw its kid or its lamb. The Sanya, we have a brisa that says, Berivi Omer, Lo Omru Yesh Drusa El B'mokum Sheyesh Matzil. B'mokum Sheyesh Matzil and Drusa. So when does a cat become a dores? Only if there are intervening first responders. Then it gets very angry. So the first brisa is referring to a case where there are no first responders. And therefore, the shita is that there's no way that the cat could create claws with venom and the victim would be a trephine unless it punctures the abdominal cavity. And those Rabbanan who reject Beribi, they hold that a cat can fatally claw kids and lambs. And therefore, Rav Chizda follows the sheet of the Chachamim. Frekta Gemara, ubemakom she'ein matzil and ein drusa. You're telling me that if no one is intervening to save the victim, then enochinami, there's no drusa. Vaha, what about the story of Ahi? Again, back to Rav Kahana. Tarnagolas Tavoid Bei Rav Kahana, there was a head, and that's Dorach. The Rav Chasel, that's right, it was being chased by a cat. V'ol idra v'schid dasha b'pei, and then the door slammed in its face. Umachaylu dasha v'sichufa. The cat swiped it, and ishtakach alei chamisha kurte dama. More answers hatzolos atzmanami katzolos achirim. Okay, boy minei Rav Kahana, and now we start our daf for today. Yesh drusa lechasul or ain drusa lechasul? The old question. Does a cat have that venom in it, such that if it claws its victim is fatally going to die? Amalei af lechulda yesh drusa. Rav holds that not only is there a drusa by a cat, but even a weasel has a drusa. A cat is considered larger than a weasel. Number two, yesh drusa lechuldo, ain't drusa. Okay, now you're telling me that the cat is larger than the chasul, than the chulda, and therefore it has drusa. But what about the weasel? The weasel is smaller than the cat, but does it have these claws? Amalei af lechasul ain't drusa. Now all of a sudden, Rav changes his tune, and he said that even a cat doesn't have the ability to claw and fatally injure its victim, which is the exact opposite of everything Rav has been saying until now. So if Rav is saying af lechasul, which is larger than a weasel, a chulda, is ein drusa, then certainly a weasel ein drusa. Now the Gemara asks another question: lechasul ulechulda yesh lem drusa, ein lem drusa. So Rav Kahana is asking Rav, what about a cat and a weasel? Do they have drusa or do they not have drusa? Amalei lechasul yesh drusa, lechulda ein drusa. Now we come back again full swing, and Rav again reiterates his position that a cat does have drusa. Not a chulda, but a cat does. So how do we reconcile all these contradictions? So Gemara says, Lo kasha, this should not be something that you're bothered by. Had the amalei af lechulda drusa. When Rav said that even a weasel has drusa, that's only drusas ophos. That's only if the weasel attacks a bird. Had the amar, that which Rav said, af lechasul ein drusa be'imri rabave, we're referring to larger animals like a large sheep, and only a wolf has drusa against imri rabave. Had the amar, and that which Rav said, that lechasul yesh drusa, lechulda ein drusa. When do we say that a chasul, according to Rav, has drusa? That could be smaller animals, like what? Like kids and lambs. Rav says that even a chulda, just one second, that Rav says that a chulda does not have drusa because a weasel cannot attack a kid or a lamb and fatally claw them. Only a cat can do that. Boy, Ravashi, vacillated. Shar ofos tmeim yesh lehem juso, ein lehem juso. We've been talking about the nets, which is a non-kosher bird, and it attacks its prey. What about other birds that are not kosher? Do they have the ability to claw and do drusa? Amalei Rav Hillel Rav Ashi Ki Avinon Bei Rav Kahana. When I was in the house of Rav Kahana, or Bei Rav might be the yeshiva of Rav Kahana, Omar, he declared Shar Ofos Tmeim Yesh Lem Drusa. Not only is there drusa by a case of a nets, but also other non-kosher birds are also darsim. So the Gemara now says, wait a minute. We have Rav Kahana telling me that Shar Ofos Tmeim Yeshem Drusa Vanantanan Drusa Sanetzbi of Hadak. It sounds like the Mishnah is saying that only a nets when it attacks a small animal, that's called an oaf, a small bird, excuse me, that's called an oaf hadak, then it engenders a treifa. But other birds of prey, other non-kosher birds, apparently are incapable of fatally clawing. What the Brisa really meant to, what the Mishnah meant to say was nets udekavase, meaning other non-kosher birds that are similar in that they pounce upon their prey. The inoch bidizutra minay, those that are not similar to the nets. Why? Because they are smaller than the nets. No, just one second. The inoch and the other birds, it is zutra minayu. The nets has a special category. It's a very powerful bird. And even though there are many other non-kosher birds that have drusa, but they only have drusa if their victim is zutra minai. It was very small, smaller than them. Whereas the nets is singled out here by the Mishnah because it has a tremendous power of drusa, even with regard to other birds that are equal in size. Ika Diamri, another possibility, is Drusus Hanetz Biderabe Mine, that we're going to go even a step further, that a net can even claw and create fatality in a bird that's larger than it. The enoch, but other birds of prey, non-kosher birds, bidikavasayu, they can only victimize a bird that has the same size as them, but they cannot fatally claw a bird that's larger than them. Rav Kahana Mishmei, Rav Shimi Barashi, Ein Drusa L'Shual. Right, a shual is a fox, and a fox doesn't have drusa. Aini, could this be so? Vaki Asa Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Bavel to from Eretz to Bavel, Omar, he declared Maisa. There was a story. Vidoras Shual Rachel v'merchat shel beis hine. So Rachel is the small sheep, and it was clawed by a fox, and this took place in the bathhouse at beis hine. Sometimes the Gemara wants to give you these details just that you know it's a real story. It really happened. So you see that even in the case of a fox, there is drusa. Rav Safra, he chasol havi. It wasn't a fox that clawed this little baby sheep, but rather it was a cat. And a cat is capable of clawing a Rachel. And this is based on Rav that we discussed, that Rav holds that a chasel has drusa for small kids or lambs, but not for larger sheep. And in this case, it was a small lamb, a she lamb. It was a Rachel, and it wasn't, fully grown. And therefore, if it was a chasul, then following in the shita of Rav, chasul has a drusa for these kinds of, she lambs that are not fully grown. Another possibility, Omer of Kahana Mishum Derav Shimi Bar Ashi Yesh Drusa L'Shual. According to this transmission, Rav Kahana held that in fact a fox has the ability of drusa. Aini is this so? V'aki Osir of Dimi Omar Maisa v'Darashul Rachel v'Merchat Shel Beis Heini Uba Maisa Nechacham V'Yomu Ein drusa. So you see that a fox is not capable of drusa. Rav Safra Hahu. There's a different version of the story there. It wasn't a fox that attacked the Rachel, but rather it was a kelev hafa. So this is what I think we call rabies. I'm not sure. But anyway, a dog is capable of drusa. Omer of Yosef Naktinen ain't drusa, but we paskin lamaisa that a dog does not have the ability to render its victim a treifa. I find that hard to believe. But again, I'm the Gevadavar because I don't really like dogs. Omer Abaye Naktinon ain't drusa el biyat. La fuke regel de lo. How did the fox, or let's go back to the lion for that matter, right? I'm sorry, to the wolf, I meant to say. Right? So the wolf has darts, but which paws, if I could use that word, clawed its victim and fatally impacted on the victim? Only the four legs, right? The two legs on the foreground. But regel, which is basically the hind legs, that even if it digs its claws into its victim, will not make it into a treifa. Ein drusa el poren, right? You have to say that the claws of the predator penetrated its victim. Lafuke shein. But if it was bitten by the fox, then it does not render its bitten victim as a treifa. Angels help me das, and we're going to have a very strange case of lafuke shalomi das, where the clawing was done without any intention. For example, the predator fell from a roof onto an animal, and the four-leg claw penetrated the animal's back. The animal fell. Furthermore, Ein drusa el michayim lafuki lachamisa delo. Now, what does this mean to the exclusion of a case where the predator claws after its death? I mean, what's that all about? Amri hashta shlomidas amrit lo liachamisa mi boy. Why bichlal did you have to tell me lachamis? Lachamisa shalomi das, right? There's less awareness than the animal falling off from a roof. And you told me if the animal falls off a roof and claws its victim, it does not generate treifa. Then how much more so liachamisa? So somehow in this whole sugya, like a lion died and fell onto an animal, and somehow its four-leg paw penetrated into the animal. And the chiddush is that it does not create tarfus. So the Gemara asks, what do I need that for? You know that shalomi das, the Bryce already established, doesn't create tarfus. How much more so if it's dead? Lo tzricha, the doris Upaskua liyadei. Paskua means they chopped off. So the predator clawed its victim, and then they chopped off the paw of the predator, and somehow it seems like the claw is still somehow attached to the victim. It's a pretty ugly scene over here. So after death here, when we say liachar misa, we're talking about a severed limb. Mao detain vahadi de doris shadi zira. In other words, immediately when the predator inserts its claws into its victim, it injects the poison. So therefore, the victim was already treifa when they chopped off the claw of the predator. Kamash malon bahadi de sholif shadi zira. In fact, the predator injects its poison only when it withdraws its claws. So if the paw was severed before it could be withdrawn, then it's a dead claw and it doesn't inject any poison. So again, when we're talking about a dead predator, we're not talking about a dead predator. We're talking about where the paw was chopped off. And that's considered a severed limb like a dead animal. So again, the paw was severed before it was withdrawn. Now it's a dead claw, and the chiddush here is, according to Abaye, that you don't assume that it could inject any poison. The victim is not a treif. Amarav Barhun Amarav Arish and Nichnas Ben Ashvarim. A lion entered into a place where there's a bunch of oxen. And we find a claw from the lion found embedded in the back of one of the oxen. Maybe that ox that has a paw embedded in its back is the lion's claw. No, we're not concerned about that possibility. My time, huh? Why not? Rov Arayis Darsin Umiyuton Ein Darsin V'chaladores Ein Tziporen Nishmetes V'zos Hol V'nish V'tziporen Yosheves Lo Begavo Eimar Bekosel Nischachech. In other words, we don't assume that a lion's claw would remain embedded in the back of one of the oxen. However, although that's true for most lions, there's a minority that one second, sorry. There's a minority of lions. I guess maybe they're in the zoo or something like that, or in a circus, and they don't claw. Coladores, and we also have to add another factor into the equation, and that is that when a predator claws, its claws does not fall out. And therefore, we're going to look at this ox that has the claws inside its back. And what are we going to say? We're going to have to say that bekosel nischachet, the ox rubbed itself against the wall. And on this wall, there's attached to the wall is a detached claw. So how did the claw become embedded in the ox back? Because the ox rubbed itself against the wall. So if this be the case, then the assumption is that that detached claw is dead, and if it's dead, then it could not effect trefa. So Gemara says, wait a minute. I'm going to tell you that we should construct an opposite rov. Adarab, on the contrary, rov shvarim ischachim. Although many oxen rub themselves against the wall, umiyuton ein mischas, and only a minority of them did not rub themselves against the wall. Kol mischachech ein tziporn yosheveslo begabel. Even if in the minority cases of an oxen, I'm sorry, in a majority case of the oxen that rub themselves against the wall, nevertheless, a claw normally does not become embedded in its back. Vizeh, and here in this case where we see the ox, v'tziporon yoshevus habagabo, and the claw is embedded in its back. Amar reader also. I would, since in most cases, even if the oxen, as it is normally done, would rub himself against the wall, but he doesn't get the claw stuck embedded in his back. And if this claw is embedded in back, then we should assume that the lion clawed it. It wasn't that the claw somehow got detached. So therefore we should be machmir, we should prohibit the ox. We could go in either direction. We could say that the claw became embedded in the back of the ox through the lion's clawing. Or we could say, no, the claw became embedded through the ox rubbing against the wall. Uki milsachazke. And this is the case, Havilei Safek Drusa. And Rav holds that Safek Drusa is kosher. Why is this Safek Drusa? Again, we don't know whether or not the lion directly put its claws, and therefore the claws was embedded in the back of the oxen, or no, the claws somehow got embedded onto the wall, and the ox rubbed itself off to the wall. And now we're going to say Uki Milsa Aches Kaseh. We always go Basel Chazaka in a Safek, and the Chazaka is that the ox was mutter until, innocent until proven guilty. The Omer Ein Choshen Safek Drusa. Omer Abai Lo Amar Nelet Tziporen. When do we say that if the claw was found on the back of the ox, Rav would be matir the ox? That's only tziporin, right? If the claw was found in the ox's back, of a makom tziporin choshu. So what is makom tziporin as opposed to tziporin? Tziporin we know is the claw. What's makom tziporin? Literally translated as the place of a claw. What it means is that a claw leaves a mark on the flesh. So even if I don't have the actual claw, but I have the mark of the claw on the ox's back, so then even Rav would say it's treif. Why? He says here Rav is matir based on the fact that it's unlikely that the claw became detached. But if we see only the mark of a claw, then the possibility of clawing is plausible. The animal is therefore forbidden. So the fact that the claw is detached already begins to put thoughts in your mind that it wasn't that the lion itself clawed its victim, the ox, but rather the ox, let's say, rubbed itself against the wall. But if you find not the claw in the ox's back, but rather you find the makom tziporin, the mark left by the claw, but not the claw itself, then Rav would be moded that it's awesome. Furthermore, tziporin nami lo amarn el lacha aval yevesha of the mishtamta. So again, Rav was matir a tziporin. So now we're saying that Rav was matir a tziporin, but not a makom tziporin. And now we're saying that Rav was matir a tziporin only if it's lacha, but if it's yevesha, if it's a dry claw, then that is common for a dry claw could become detached from a line. And therefore, if we find a dry claw embedded in the ox's back, Rav would say it's treifa. Nami, and even in the case of a moist claw, which we said that Rav is matul, if there are two or three claws found embedded in the ox's back, I mean, this is mamish. I wouldn't read this in a children's book to children; it's too gory. But anyway, we're concerned that maybe the animal, the lion, actually clawed its victim, and therefore it's treif. And we don't assume that the animal rubbed itself against the wall and got three different claws embedded in its back. Okay, let's say that these two or three claws that we said that now the animal's treif, and we don't assume the possibility of the animal rubbing itself against the wall, that's only if the two or three claws are situated in a row, in a pattern. Then it looks like a lion's paw. Itmar Rav Amar in Choshin l'Safek Drusa. Shmuel Amar Chayshinan l'Safek Drusa. The Kuli Alma both agree that Suffolk law, we don't know that a predator actually came into where the animals were, is Ema Lokal. And this has to do with Suffolk Tumrishus Arabim. And Suffolk Tumrishus Hayachid. And the Suffolk Tumah means that we know it was all. We know it went into the Rishus Hayachid. Here, we don't even know if it entered. And therefore, even Shmuel would agree that the animal is kosher. Safek kalba, safek shunra. If we know that the victim was definitely clawed, but we don't know if it was clawed by a dog or by a cat, ema kalba, I'm going to assume it was a dog, and therefore the animal, the victim, is treif. Just 1 second. No, did I get this wrong? What do we say about a dog? I got to remind myself. Rabbi, remind me, what do we say about a dog? That the dog has drusa, no? Or who kelev hava. Yeah. Who kelev hava. The Gemara says it's capable of drusa. So what does this mean, Ema kalba? What does that mean, Ema kalba? Ema kalba means that he says here in the footnote, we have the right to assume that possibility, and the animal is therefore permitted. Hmm. Okay, we don't have an answer to that question right now. Maybe it'll come up in the Gemara. Let's go on. All shasik v'isuv beinayu. It's like the story of Daniel and his three friends, right? The lion came in and he sat himself down amongst the shvarim, amongst the oxen, sitting quietly amongst them. He's like having conversation. Emar shlama shav, right? He didn't claw them. Kata resha, the animal, meaning the lion, tore the head of one of the oxen. Nachmer siche. Then its fury was assuaged. And therefore, we don't assume that it clawed any other ox. Iu kama ave ve'inu kama karkin. The lion is roaring, and the oxen are crying out of pain. But use kamivase. We're going to assume that both the lion and the shvarim are frightened, adadi, of one another. Very strange that the lion is frightened by the oxen. Anyway, since they're both frightened, then we have no reason to assume that there was any clawing going on.